In this video, we will look at Hampshire and Sussex in Roman times, with special attention to Chichester and the West Sussex coastal plain. Right, good morning everyone.
Good morning.
Nice to see you. So, you've been studying the Romans, so let's start with a few questions. Where are the Romans from? Yes?
Italy.
Italy. And they had an empire, didn't they? So what's an empire? Yes?
It's a big group of people that one ruler controls.
Yeah, one ruler controls. And can anyone tell me what countries were in the Roman Empire? Yes?
Britain,
Yeah, I think so. That's right.
Spain.
Very good.
Can't remember the other one.
That's all right. Someone else, yes?
England.
Yeah.
That was in it, but I can't remember.
Yes.
Paris.
And what's Paris? And what's France, yes. One more, yeah.
Croatia.
I'm not even sure if Croatia was part of the Roman Empire, so I'd have to check that. But you might be right. You might be right. It was a very big area, wasn't it? And also North Africa, what's now Egypt, Morocco. That was all part of the Roman Empire, and Britain was one of the last countries to be taken in the part of the Roman Empire, which I'm sure you've learned about. So there'll be plenty of questions as we go along. But before we talk about the Romans, before the Romans came, the people here were in the Iron Age. So what can you tell me about the Iron Age? Someone who hasn't... yes?
They used iron to make tools and stuff.
Yes.
They were a lot better than the Roman Age.
That they had quality... Yes?
The Iron Age, there was Iron Age, Bronze Age, and a lot of Stone Age. Stone Age is when they used a lot of stone for making tools. Bronze Age is when they discovered bronze and they used bronze, and Iron Age is when they used iron.
And why was iron better than bronze?
Because bronze, I don't actually.
Yeah. Yes.
Bronze decomposes more than iron does.
Yes, so iron is... What's the word I'm looking for? Yes.
Stronger.
So yeah, harder. You can do... bronze is quite a soft metal. Iron is very hard. So when the Romans came here, this wasn't an empty land, was it? It wasn't empty. There were people living here, and we call these the Iron Age people. And sometimes we call them the Celts. Have you heard of that word, the Celts? And sometimes they're called the Britons. Now, this is very confusing. You have to think about this very carefully, that the Britons were not the same as the English. So there were no such people as the English at this time. Yes?
The English is different to England because England's part of English, and English has, I think, Northern Ireland and Wales.
Well, that's the United Kingdom. That's very good thinking. Yes, there's more to... Today, the United Kingdom is Scotland, Wales, England and Northern Ireland. But none of those names existed in those days. And there were no people called the English because the English came from the Anglo-Saxons, who you'll be learning about in the summer term. So there were no people called the English. But actually, there were no people really called Britons or Celts, because the people who lived here didn't call themselves that. The people who lived here, if you'd said, oh, you were Briton, they'd have looked at you and wouldn't know what you were talking about. If you'd said to me, you were Celt, they wouldn't have known that name. That was the name other people gave them. Now, the people who were living here, they had a name. They were the Atrebates. That was the name. They were the Atrebates. That was the name of their tribe. So there wasn't one country. So England today is one country. But in those days, before the Romans came, there were lots of small countries, and they all had names. And they were all quite hostile to each other. What do I mean by hostile? Yes? Enemies, yes. And sometimes very bad enemies, so they'd have wars. Other times just a bit standoffish, like, you know, you stay there and we'll be here. And one of the most visible bits of evidence from the Iron Age in Sussex are hill forts. Have you been to hill forts? No. No. So before the Romans came, the people who lived here made forts. Now, what's the difference between a fort and a castle? Someone, yes.
Castles are big stone are ruled by one person. Forts don't have a ruler.
Well, they may have a ruler, but you were right. A castle's made of stone. A fort isn't made of stone.
It's made of leather.
It could have leather, but wood, mainly wood. And now this is Sisbury Ring, north of Worthing, which is the second biggest hill fort in the whole of England. It's very, very big. And of course, all the wood's rotted away. You won't see any wood, but what you will see is where the Iron Age people dug down into the chalk and made a great big mound of chalk, which goes all the way around the top of the hill, and a great big ditch that they dug out of. Is that all right now? Good. I don't want my battery to run low. I may stop talking. So if you go to Sisbury Ring, you'll be amazed how big it is. And these weren't primitive people. Now, the Romans, they wrote the history of what happened. And the people who were living here, the Atrebates and these other tribes, we don't know what they thought because they didn't have writing. So they were clever people. They made things out of iron. They built hill forts, but they didn't have writing. So the only way we know what happened is what the Romans wrote. Now, why might we be a bit suspicious about what the Romans wrote? Yes?
Because they might have wrote something to make them sound stronger.
Yes, and make the Britons look
Really
weak and make them look bad, because what the Romans were doing in making an empire was they were taking over other people's land and making those people do what they wanted. So that's not a great thing to do, is it really? But they had to justify it. And they'd say, well, we're doing it because these people are barbarians. Do you know that word, barbarian? So what's a barbarian? Yes. Not what? Not Roman, yes. But also, what does it imply? Is being a barbarian a good thing? Yeah.
No, because you take over other people.
Well, it has the implication of a barbarian is that you're not civilized and you're not really, you don't deserve to rule yourself because you're almost animal-like. So if I just go ahead, actually. Yeah, that's the one I wanted. That's the one I wanted. So that is how the Romans saw the Britons. So these people are naked, they're covered in tattoos, and they're very warlike. The man and the woman there with spears. Now, when the Romans first came to Britain, do you know who it was? Who was the leader of the Romans when they first came to Britain? Yes?
Julius Caesar.
Exactly, Julius Caesar. Probably the most, well, definitely. Yes?
Which the rebels, they have this swords or spears. Did they just have them?
What, the Britons?
Yes.
They mainly had spears. Some of the leaders would have had swords, but mainly spears, whereas the Romans had all sorts of different weapons. Yes?
They didn't take over the whole of England.
No.
They only took a bit.
They took a bit, and in fact, I've got a map of that. So there we are. This is how, so Julius Caesar crossed over from France, which wasn't called France then. Anyone knows what it was called then? Yes, do you know? Perhaps you don't, perhaps you haven't learnt this. You've mentioned it. Anyone know? Begins with G. Yes? Gaul, that's right, Gaul. And sometimes when we talk about things that are French, we still say that's quite Gallic. So that word hasn't completely disappeared. It was Gaul. And Julius Caesar, when he conquered Gaul, was very, very brutal. huge numbers of people in Gaul were killed by the Romans. So it was a very it was a very violent thing, having an empire. Often when we go and look at a villa and it all looks beautiful, we'll look at the mosaics later. And you've been to Bignor, haven't you? Bignor Roman Villa. See, it all looks very beautiful, lovely mosaics. It all seems calm and peaceful. But the making of the empire was often very, very violent, and many people died. But as one of you just said, Julius Caesar came and he went into a large part of what's now southeast England, but of course it wasn't called England then, and then he went home. So really the reason that he did this is because Julius Caesar was a leader. And in Rome, the capital of the empire, he needed to be popular. Because when he was away from Rome, if he was unpopular, what might happen? Yes?
Wouldn't he be locked there? Like he wouldn't be able to go back?
He wouldn't be able to go back because people might think, we don't want Julius Caesar anymore, we want some other leader. So he wanted to make the people happy. And he did it by trying to make sure they had a lot of food and by giving them lots of entertainment, things that amused them. But what people really liked were big victories. So he went to Britain, not because he really needed to or that he really wanted to, but he thought, won't that look good? I can tell the people in Rome, I've conquered another country. I'm a brilliant leader. I'm a brilliant general. So he came and then he left because he'd done all that he needed to. Yes?
There was someone called Boudica.
Yes. Well, we'll talk about her. Yes, in a minute. Thank you. Yes, there was indeed. So it was 100 years later that the Romans came again. But when they came again, they stayed. And that's interesting. That's very interesting because when the Romans came a second time, yes, go on.
When the first time he tried to attack Britain, he lost.
There were some battles they didn't do so well. That's true. But when they came the second time, yes.
Is it because that Julius Caesar fell in love?
Well, in Britain, he fell in love with Cleopatra, who was the leader of Egypt, but well remembered. But I don't think he fell in love with anyone in Britain. But I might be wrong. You never know with Julius Caesar. He fell in love with lots of people. But the second time the Romans came, they stayed. And so they had to conquer the whole country. So there were lots of battles. But not all the Britons. So some of the Britons said, we don't want the Romans. We don't want you here. We're going to fight you to get you out of our country. But not everybody. So I was saying about the Atrebates, the tribe that lived here, their leader was a man called Toggy Dubnus. Yeah? Toggy Dubnus. So you won't forget that name, will you? Now, why do you think some leaders of the British tribes would have been supporting the Romans? Yes.
Because they have so many people, and they think if they support them, they won't have to get any more of their soldiers killed.
Yes, that's true. But also, now look, this is a picture of Roman London. So the Romans were the first people to build a town in London. Before the Romans, there was nothing there. Now look at that. Now if you were a British chieftain, if you were leading the tribe of the Atrebates, and you knew the Romans could build that, what might you be thinking the Romans could do for you? Yes?
They could build a city, and also people might be supportive of the Romans because their chief that time had a really awkward name.
Because he had an awkward, yeah. No, that's very good. Thank you. Yes, he could get a lot out of it. So now you've been to Bignor Roman Villa, which is big, But the biggest villa, the biggest, in fact, it wasn't, it was a palace, is this one near Chichester called Fishbourne. Have you done Fishbourne? I mentioned that. So Fishbourne was huge. Now this is a model of it. Look how big that is, just for one man. And that was where Toggy Dubnus lived. Right? Toggy Dubnus. But before the Romans came, what sort of building do you think he might have lived in? Yes.
Me?
Yes. What do you think it might have been made of?
Bricks?
No, wouldn't have been made of brick. Yes.
Stone?
Not even stone, no. Yes. Something very simple. Yes. Wood. And the roof, and what would the roof be made of? Any ideas? Yes. Straw, yes. So that's not great, is it? If you're living in a straw hut and then you're living in that, you'd think, wow, that was a good deal. Now, someone mentioned Boudica. Who mentioned Boudica? Yeah, Boudica. Yes, you did. Very good. So, I think I've got a picture of her. This is one of the mosaics. So not only did he have a palace, Toggy Dubnus, he had these beautiful mosaics, these pictures made out of little coloured stones or tiles. Yes.
Wouldn't the Roman mosaic artists make a mistake in every mosaic because they thought the Roman gods were the only people in the world who were the goodest?
Yeah, the Roman gods, I'll talk about them in a moment. They were very important. Now, I can't remember, I think I've got a slide of... Well, this is more like Bigner. That's because... So Bigner was really a farm. So Bigner Roman Villa was really a glorious, magnificent farmhouse. Now, have I got I can't remember if I've got... I think I might have a picture of Boadicea. But who was she anyway? Sometimes she's called Boadicea, sometimes Boudica. Yes, who was she?
She was part of the English tribes that you said.
The British tribes, yeah.
Yeah, and she had a lot of people. She got a lot of people and tried and I think successfully burnt down Roman London.
She did, and Roman Colchester, and Roman St Albans. So she took a very different attitude, which was, I don't want the Romans here. And her tribe was called the Iceni. So the tribe here was the Atrebates, her tribe was the Iceni. And she could have really brought an end to Roman Britain. If she hadn't been stopped, the Romans could have been forced out of Britain. And one of the reasons they didn't was because down here, in what's now Sussex, King Toggy Dubnus, at his palace in Fishbourne, gave the Romans all the support they needed. And that helped them to win, because they knew that they were safe here and they could get their army together to attack Boudica and defeat her. So they were so pleased with him afterwards that they made his palace even bigger and grander. And he had the biggest house in the whole of Britain. No one lived in a bigger palace or lived more splendidly or with greater riches than Toggy Dubnus. So you can ask yourself the question, can't you? Who made the right choice? Toggy Dubnus or Boudica? What do you think?
Toggy Dubnus?
Yeah, well, why do you think he made the best decision?
Because he helped the Romans defeat the...
Boudica. But how do you think people who supported Boudica, how do you think they thought about Toggy Dubnus? Yes.
They thought he was wrong because they wanted to
Get the Romans out. They thought he was a traitor. But he didn't care because he was doing very, very well, wasn't he? So this is a bit more like Fishbourne would have appeared, Bignor. And we call them Roman villas, but I think villa is yes.
Villa means house.
It does, yes. But often when people today, when they go on holiday, they say, oh, we're staying in a villa somewhere. It sounds just like a place to go on holiday to, doesn't it? So in a way, we call them villas, but they're really farmhouses, but they're very rich farmhouses and very luxurious. Yes?
All of the planets are named after Roman gods.
The plants?
All the planets.
Oh, the planets, yes.
Sun.
Yeah, Jupiter and Mars, that's right, they were. Now, usually the villas, the farmhouses, were built close to rivers. Now, why do you think they would have been built close to rivers? Yes.
So that you get supplies from other countries.
Supplies, but also,
Like food.
yeah. So the stuff coming in, but also, yes. Pardon? Well, they probably got plenty of water. Someone who, yes. Fish. So, but what I'm trying to get at is that there was stuff coming into the villa, but what might have been going out? Yes.
They might have been going out food,
Selling food to other countries. And what food do you think they'd have been selling? Yes. But what? So you think? So the villa's like a farmhouse. So what would the farm be growing? And what's bread made out of? Wheat. Yes. So huge amount of wheat was grown at Bignor and all the other villas in West Sussex. And it was sold all across the Roman Empire. And because the Roman Empire was so big, you could sell a lot of wheat. And because they sold so much, that's why these people became rich. But the important thing to remember and the important thing to learn is that the people who were living in these villas weren't Romans, they weren't Italians, they were Britons. They were the people living here. They were the friends of Toggy-Dubnus. They're the friends of Toggy-Dubnus who did very well because the Romans were very supportive of him. And so these farmers who had been living in wooden huts with straw roofs were now living this luxurious lifestyle. So in their lifetime, they'd gone from being quite poor to being very rich, all thanks to the Romans. So, these buildings, they could almost be modern, couldn't they? I mean, they look. If something was built like that today, you wouldn't be that surprised. They were building to a high quality, using stone, using tiles on the roof, and sometimes these buildings had very luxurious. Look at this one. Very, very impressive, isn't it? Have you learned about, there's two things the Romans had in their big houses that were really quite special and luxurious, things that the Britons could never have dreamed of. Do you know how they kept warm? Yes, go on.
So, there's heating. I know how they had heating.
And how did the heating work?
They didn't have any windows. Well, they did.
But no glass.
No glass.
No. So someone wants to... Yes, how do they have the heating? Yes, at the very end, yes.
Because basically one of the slaves would light fire in this tunnel at the end of the building.
Yes.
And then they would have pipes through to their winter room. And then the pipe would come through and all the steam would heat up the floor.
Yes.
And then they would put their feet.
That's really good explanation, yes. So they had central heating, kept their houses nice and warm. And the other thing that they had, to keep themselves clean, what did they have? Yes.
Showers.
No, they didn't have showers, no. Yes.
They had towels.
Go, yes?
They had these like pools. And
Yes.
And it was like bricks here, and then bricks here, and then bricks here. And
Yes.
it would be like a triangle or pyramid going down.
Yeah, they had baths, but they were like swimming baths. They were big. They were big, and yes?
If you weren't very rich and you were a normal person in the Roman Empire,
Yeah.
like in the big cities of the Roman Empire, they would have special bathing houses where you could go.
Yes, they did. They did. And because of the central heating, they were warm. So they were warm baths. So if you think about it, how the people had been living here and how they started to live under the Romans was much, much better, especially if you were rich. Now, these drawings are created by artists who are specialists in recreating the past. But what I've noticed is that when you get these historical recreations of what Roman Britain looked like, they always seem to make them look like this. What's the weather like? Yes, sunny, and look how they're dressed. Do they look? They look like they're dressed for? Yes, they're wearing togas. That's not a warm clothes, is it? Is it? No. Yes. It's summer. These pictures always seem to be in the summer. I'll come back to you in a minute. They always seem to be in the summer, as if when the Romans came, they brought their hot Italian weather with them. But they didn't bring their hot Italian weather with them, did they? So most of the time, if you were living in Britain, in Roman Britain, it was more like that, with lots of snow. So they really did need to keep warm. Now these are a couple of Roman soldiers. Now, so I said to you, the Roman villas in Sussex, generally the people who living in them weren't Romans, they weren't Italians. They were local people, but they were local people who adopted the Roman ways. So they dressed as Romans, they spoke as Romans, they had the Roman gods, and they even gave themselves Roman names, and then the Romans would make them Roman citizens. So if you were a Roman citizen, what's a citizen? Yes. Yeah, you're part of that country or place. If you were a Roman citizen, you had the right to live anywhere in the empire. You could go and live in Gaul, you could go and live in North Africa. You were free to travel anywhere you liked if you were a Roman citizen. So being a Roman citizen was a privilege and a really good thing. But not everyone was a Roman citizen, and some people were slaves. So, what's a slave? Someone who hasn't... yes? Yes. Yes. So, anyone else want to tell me what a slave is? Yes.
The people that work for rich people, so they don't have to do it themselves.
Yes. But what is it about being a slave that makes you a bit trapped? Yes.
You can't go on holidays.
You can't go on holidays, no. You can't, basically, if you're a slave, you are owned by that person. So how many of you have got cats or dogs? Yes, quite a few of you. So if you've got a dog, that dog can't make its own decisions, can it? That dog is controlled by you. But the dog doesn't know any better. The dog's very happy to be controlled by you. But do you think all the slaves were happy being slaves? No, they weren't happy. Now, what it was like to be a slave depended on who owned you, right? So some people who owned slaves treated them very cruelly and badly. Other people treated their slaves very well and kindly. But even if they treated their slaves very well and kindly, they couldn't make their own decisions. In fact, you could almost say that you as children are like well-treated slaves. Because, well, How many of you could say to your mum and dad, right, I'm going on holiday to France now, see you in 2 weeks? You couldn't do that, could you? If you would like the full talk of the Romans in Sussex and Hampshire to be given at your school, please contact Chris Hare at the email address below.